Beneath Autumn Skies by Evelyn Merrick. The autumn of 1847 painted the Virginia countryside in hues of amber and crimson. Margaret Fairchild stood at the edge of her family's property, watching the sun dip behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. At 23, she had long since abandoned the frivolous dreams of her youth. The war with Mexico had claimed her fiancé, Lieutenant James Everett, leaving her with nothing but memories and a collection of unanswered letters. Margaret's father, Judge William Fairchild, had been patient with her mourning, but after 2 years, his patience had worn thin. "You cannot spend your life in solitude," he had told her that morning over breakfast. "The Harrington ball is tomorrow evening, and I expect you to attend." She had nodded, knowing argument was futile. Her father, though loving, was a man accustomed to having his will obeyed. Since her mother's passing a decade prior, he had raised Margaret with a firm but gentle hand, ensuring she received an education befitting a judge's daughter. She could speak French, play the pianoforte, and discuss politics with the same ease as she could manage a household. As twilight descended, Margaret reluctantly made her way back to the grand colonial house that had been her family's home for 3 generations. The familiar creak of the porch steps greeted her, a sound that had accompanied her entire life. Inside, Lucinda, the housekeeper who had helped raise her, was lighting oil lamps. "Your father's in his study," Lucinda said without looking up. "Says he wants to speak with you before supper." Margaret nodded and made her way to the oak-paneled room where her father spent most evenings. She knocked softly. "Enter," came the deep voice from within. Judge Fairchild sat behind his massive desk, spectacles perched on his nose as he examined a document. At 58, his once dark hair had turned silver, though his posture remained as straight as when he'd served in the War of 1812. "Ah, Margaret," he said, removing his spectacles. "I've received word that Samuel Clayton has returned from his travels abroad." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Samuel Clayton, son of her father's oldest friend, Colonel Clayton, had been her childhood companion before departing for Europe 5 years ago to expand his family's shipping business. "I've invited him to accompany us to the Harringtons' ball tomorrow," her father continued, studying her reaction. "He expressed particular interest in seeing you again." "Father, Margaret," he interrupted gently, "James has been gone for 2 years. He would not want you to spend your life in mourning. Samuel is a good man from a respectable family. At the very least, rekindle your friendship." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As she turned to leave, her father added, "He's changed, Margaret. He's not the same impetuous boy who left Virginia." That night, Margaret stood before her wardrobe, examining gowns she hadn't worn since before James's death. Her fingers traced the fine silk of a midnight blue dress, a gift from her aunt in Philadelphia. Perhaps it was time to step back into the world of the living. Samuel Clayton adjusted his cravat in the mirror of his father's Richmond home. At 28, his reflection showed a man hardened by experience rather than the carefree youth who had left American shores 5 years before. His travels had taken him from London to Paris, from Berlin to St. Petersburg, where he had negotiated contracts that had doubled the Clayton Shipping Company's profits. Yet for all his success, a hollow sensation had followed him across oceans and continents. It was only upon receiving his father's letter, mentioning that Margaret Fairchild remained unmarried, that Samuel had decided to return to Virginia. They had grown up together, Samuel and Margaret, their families' estates neighboring one another. As children, they had explored the woodlands, fished in the creek, and stolen pies cooling on windowsills. As adolescents, they had shared books and dreams, hers of becoming a writer, his of seeing the world. When he'd told her of his plans to leave for Europe, he had half expected, half hoped she would ask him to stay. Instead, she had wished him well and, within months of his departure, become engaged to Lieutenant Everett. The news had reached Samuel in London, a brief mention in his father's letter that had altered his perception of home. He had thrown himself into work, into European society, into brief affairs with women whose names he now struggled to recall. "Your carriage is ready, Mr. Clayton," the butler announced from the doorway. Samuel nodded, taking a final glance in the mirror. Tonight he would see Margaret again, and despite his worldly experiences and sophistication, he found himself as nervous as a schoolboy. The Harrington mansion blazed with light, carriages lined the circular drive, and the sounds of an orchestra drifted through the night air. Margaret sat beside her father in their carriage, her hands clutching her reticule so tightly her knuckles whitened. "You look beautiful," Judge Fairchild said, patting her hand. Your mother would be proud." The compliment brought a slight smile to Margaret's lips. She had chosen the midnight blue gown, its modest décolletage and slim silhouette flattering her figure without being ostentatious. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant chignon, adorned with a single pearl comb that had belonged to her mother. As their carriage joined the queue, Margaret caught sight of a familiar figure standing on the mansion steps, tall and broad-shouldered, with chestnut hair and a bearing that commanded attention. Samuel Clayton had indeed changed. The boyish features she remembered having matured into those of a man accustomed to authority. When their eyes met across the distance, Margaret felt a jolt of recognition, not of the boy she had known, but of something new and unsettling. She looked away quickly, focusing on gathering her skirts as the carriage came to a stop. Judge Fairchild descended first, then turned to assist her. As Margaret's foot touched the ground, another hand appeared, extended toward her. "Miss Fairchild," Samuel said, his voice deeper than she remembered. "It's been too long." She placed her gloved hand in his, the gesture automatic. "Mr. Clayton, welcome home." His smile revealed a small scar at the corner of his mouth that hadn't been there before. "Thank you, though I must confess I wasn't certain of my welcome." Before she could respond, they were swept into the receiving line. Margaret greeted the Harringtons mechanically, her awareness fixed on Samuel's presence beside her. The ballroom was a swirl of color and light, the orchestra playing a lively reel. Margaret allowed herself to be led to a group of familiar faces, daughters of neighboring plantations, young wives of local businessmen, while Samuel was immediately surrounded by curious gentlemen eager for news of Europe. "Is that Samuel Clayton?" whispered Caroline Mercer, a friend since childhood. "He's become quite impressive." Margaret nodded, watching as Samuel described something with animated gestures, the group around him laughing appreciatively. "He's been away for 5 years." "And returned just in time to find you available?" Caroline observed with a knowing smile. "How convenient." "It's not like that," Margaret protested, though the idea sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "We were merely childhood friends." "Of course," Caroline replied, clearly unconvinced. "Then you won't mind if I claim the first dance with him?" Before Margaret could respond, the orchestra struck up a waltz, and Samuel appeared before them, bowing politely to Caroline before turning to Margaret. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked, extending his hand. Margaret hesitated, aware of Caroline's surprised expression. "I haven't danced in some time, Mr. Clayton." "Neither have I," he admitted. "At least not with anyone who mattered." The sincerity in his voice made refusal impossible. Margaret placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. As they took their positions, she noted the differences in him, the confidence in his stance, the subtle cologne that hinted of foreign markets, the way his eyes seemed to see beyond her carefully composed expression. "You're staring, Miss Fairchild," he murmured as they began to move with the music. "I'm merely observing the changes in you," she replied. "Europe has left its mark." His hand at her waist guided her through a turn. "As his time on all of us. I was sorry to hear about Lieutenant Everett. He was a brave man." The mention of James should have pained her, but Margaret found herself nodding with a sense of distance that surprised her. "Yes, he was." "And you've been in mourning these 2 years." It seemed appropriate. Samuel's expression softened. "And now?" "Now," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "I find myself at a ball, dancing with an old friend who has become a stranger." He smiled, the scar by his mouth deepening. "Then perhaps we should reacquaint ourselves, Margaret." The use of her Christian name, inappropriate in this setting, should have shocked her. Instead, it awakened memories of summer afternoons by the creek, of shared confidences and innocent affection. "Your father tells me you've expanded the Clayton shipping routes to the Baltic," she said, shifting to safer ground. "Yes, though I suspect that's not what you truly wish to know about my time away." The dance brought them closer, then apart, a physical metaphor for the years that had separated them. "What do I wish to know, Mr. Clayton?" "Whether I thought of you," he said quietly. "Whether I regretted leaving. Whether I found what I was looking for." The music crescendoed, and Margaret missed a step, her rhythm disrupted by his candor. Samuel's arm tightened around her waist, steadying her. "And did you?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "I found success," he replied, "but not peace." The waltz ended, and they stood momentarily frozen while couples around them applauded the orchestra. Samuel bowed, and Margaret curtsied, the formal gestures at odds with the intimacy of their conversation. "Would you care for some air?" he asked, offering his arm. Margaret knew she should decline. Propriety demanded she dance with other partners, that she not show preference to one gentleman so openly. But the ballroom suddenly seemed stifling, the conversations around her trivial. "Yes," she said, placing her hand on his arm, "I would." The Harringtons' garden was illuminated by paper lanterns strung between trees, providing islands of light amid the darkness. A few other couples strolled the pathways, maintaining proper distance from one another, chaperones hovering discreetly nearby. Samuel led Margaret to a stone bench beside a small fountain, far enough from the main path to allow conversation, but still within sight of the ballroom windows. "You haven't asked why I returned," he said as they sat, a respectable space between them. Margaret arranged her skirts, buying time. "I assumed it was for business. Your father is advancing in years." "That was part of it," Samuel admitted, "but not the entirety." A cool breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the scent of late roses. Margaret shivered slightly, and Samuel immediately removed his jacket, placing it around her shoulders despite her protest. "I've weathered Russian winters," he said with a smile. "A Virginia autumn holds no challenge." The jacket carried his warmth and scent, enveloping Margaret in a cocoon that felt dangerously intimate. "You were about to explain your return," she prompted, needing to maintain the conversation. Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the flowing water of the fountain. "I received word of Lieutenant Everett's passing shortly after it happened. I considered returning then, but thought my presence might be unwelcome." "Why would you think that?" He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "We didn't part on the best of terms, Margaret." "We were young," she said softly. "You had ambitions beyond Virginia, and I had different expectations." "You expected me to declare myself," Samuel said bluntly. "To propose before I left." The directness of his statement surprised her. The Samuel she had known had been more circumspect, less willing to expose his thoughts. "It was a girlish fancy," she replied, embarrassed by his accurate assessment. "James offered stability, respectability." "Things I couldn't provide then," Samuel finished. "But you never gave me the chance to try." Margaret stood abruptly, his jacket sliding from her shoulders. "That's unfair. You spoke of nothing but leaving, of seeing places I would never see, of experiences I could never share. What was I to think?" Samuel rose as well, retrieving his jacket from the bench. "You were to think that I would return, that some journeys are circular, not linear." "You never said." "I didn't know how," he interrupted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made Margaret's breath catch. "I was 23, Margaret, full of ambition but empty of wisdom. I thought you understood." A throat cleared nearby, and they turned to find Judge Fairchild standing at the entrance to their secluded spot. "The next set is beginning," he said mildly. "Miss Harrington was asking after you, Samuel." The moment shattered, reality intruding on their private reunion. Margaret composed herself, adjusting a curl that had come loose from her chignon. "Of course," Samuel said smoothly. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Fairchild." He bowed and departed, leaving Margaret alone with her father. "That seemed a rather intense conversation for a garden stroll," Judge Fairchild observed. Margaret smiled weakly. "We were merely catching up on old times." Her father's knowing look suggested he wasn't fooled, but he merely offered his arm. "Shall we return to the ball? Miss Harrington mentioned you might assist with the refreshment committee." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of duties and dances. Margaret caught glimpses of Samuel partnering various young ladies, his manner charming but reserved. He danced once more with her before the evening concluded, their conversation deliberately light, focusing on mutual acquaintances and changes to Richmond society. As their carriage rolled home through the darkness, Judge Fairchild studied his daughter's pensive expression. "Samuel asked permission to call tomorrow," he said casually. "I told him you typically take your afternoon walk at 3. Margaret turned from the window. "Father, I'm not certain." "Margaret," he interrupted gently, "life offers few second chances. Samuel Clayton may not be the man you thought you wanted at 18, but perhaps he's the man you need at 23. She remained silent for the rest of the journey, her thoughts a tumultuous mix of past and present, memory and possibility. The following afternoon found Margaret walking along the creek that separated the Fairchild and Clayton properties. The path was familiar, worn smooth by years of use. As children, she and Samuel had claimed this territory as their own, building crude forts and engaging in mock battles against imaginary enemies. She paused at a massive oak tree where they had carved their initials one summer, tracing the faded marks with her fingertips. The wood had grown around the carving, distorting the letters but preserving them nonetheless. "I wasn't sure it would still be here," Samuel's voice came from behind her. Margaret turned to find him standing a few yards away, dressed simply in riding clothes, his horse tethered to a sapling nearby. "Some things endure," she replied, stepping back from the tree. Samuel approached, examining their youthful handiwork. "We were determined to leave our mark, weren't we? To prove we existed." "Is that why you went to Europe? To leave your mark on the world?" He shook his head, falling into step beside her as she continued along the path. "I went because I was restless, because I wanted to prove myself worthy." "Worthy of what?" "Of you," he said simply. Margaret stopped walking, turning to face him. "You never indicated." "I thought it was understood," Samuel interrupted. "My father had nothing when he started. Everything the Claytons have, he built from nothing. I couldn't ask for your hand when I had nothing of my own to offer." "I never cared about wealth," Margaret protested. "But I did," Samuel replied. "Not for its own sake, but for what it represented: independence, security, the ability to provide. Your father is a respected judge, Margaret. I was the son of a self-made man with a reputation for ruthlessness in business. Father always liked you. As the boy who fished with his daughter, yes. As a potential husband, that required more than likability." They resumed walking, the afternoon sun filtering through the canopy of autumn leaves above them. "And now?" Margaret asked after a moment of silence. "What do you want now, Samuel?" He stopped at a bend in the creek, where the water pooled deeply enough for swimming. This spot had been their favorite retreat during the sweltering Virginia summers. "Now," Samuel said quietly, "I want what I've always wanted. A chance." Margaret watched the play of sunlight on the water, gathering her thoughts. "Things have changed. I've changed." "As have I," he acknowledged. "I'm not asking for a declaration, Margaret. Just time to know the woman you've become, time for you to know the man I am now." A fish jumped in the creek, creating ripples that spread in ever-widening circles. Margaret was reminded of how actions like those ripples continued long after their origin, affecting everything in their path. "When James died," she said slowly, "I thought my future died with him. Not because our love was the stuff of poetry, but because it was predictable, safe. I knew exactly what my life would be as Mrs. James Everett." Samuel remained silent, allowing her to continue. "These past 2 years, I've discovered something unexpected in my grief: freedom. Freedom to read what I wish, to think as I please, to manage Father's household in my own way." She turned to face him. "I'm not the same girl who waited for you to speak before you left for Europe." "I wouldn't want you to be," Samuel replied. "That girl existed in a world of limited horizons. I'd like to know the woman who has found freedom in sorrow." His understanding surprised her. The Samuel who had left Virginia would have argued, would have tried to persuade. This man simply listened. "Tell me about Europe," she said, resuming their walk. "Did you find what you were looking for?" A smile touched his lips. "I found many things: business acumen, cultural appreciation, several languages I speak badly. I saw the sun rise over the Alps, and set on the Baltic Sea. I danced at balls in Parisian mansions and drank tea in London drawing rooms." "It sounds magnificent," Margaret said, unable to keep a note of wistfulness from her voice. "Parts of it were," Samuel admitted. "But there were nights in strange cities when I would have traded it all for an evening on this creek with a girl who understood me without words." The simple honesty of his statement touched Margaret more deeply than florid declarations might have. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a fallen log that spanned the narrowest part of the creek, another landmark from their shared past. Samuel tested the log with his foot. It seemed sturdy enough. "Shall we cross?" The question held more significance than the simple words suggested. To cross meant to enter Clayton property, to extend their time together beyond the boundaries of a casual encounter. Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, let's cross." Samuel went first, then offered his hand to steady her. The contact, brief though it was, sent warmth spiraling up her arm. Once across, he didn't immediately release her hand, and she didn't pull away. "I have a proposal," he said as they continued along the path that would eventually lead to the Clayton house. "Not that kind," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "A different sort of proposition." "I'm listening." "I'm returning to London in 3 months to finalize our European contracts. Come with me." Margaret stopped walking. "Samuel, that's improper? Scandalous?" "Not as you're thinking," he clarified. "My aunt, Miss Eleanor Winthrop, resides in London. She's been asking me to bring suitable American company for years. You would stay with her, be introduced to society, see a world beyond Virginia." The idea was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Margaret had imagined for her future, that she couldn't immediately form a response. "Father would never allow it?" she finally said. "He might," Samuel countered, "especially if he understood my intentions." "Which are?" Samuel's gaze was steady. "To show you the world you've only read about, to see it anew through your eyes. And yes, to court you properly, Margaret, not as the ghost of a memory or a childhood attachment, but as the woman you are now." A flock of geese passed overhead, their formation a perfect V against the blue sky. Margaret watched them, symbols of journey and return, of instinctive knowing of where one belongs. "I'll consider it," she said at last. "That's all I can promise now." Samuel nodded, accepting her caution. "That's all I ask." They turned back toward Fairchild property, retracing their steps in thoughtful silence. At the great oak with their carved initials, Samuel paused. "Regardless of your decision about London," he said, "may I call on you again?" Margaret smiled, the expression coming more naturally than it had in years. "Yes, you may call." Over the following weeks, Samuel became a regular visitor to the Fairchild home. He joined them for Sunday dinners, accompanied Margaret and her father to church services, and engaged Judge Fairchild in long discussions about international law and commerce. To Margaret's surprise, her father seemed to approve of Samuel's attentions. "Clayton has matured," he remarked one evening after Samuel had departed. "Europe has refined him without diminishing his American practicality." Margaret had nodded, unwilling to confess how much she had come to look forward to Samuel's visits. They had fallen into a comfortable pattern: walks in the afternoon, chess games in the evening, discussions about books and ideas that often left her father dozing in his armchair. Samuel spoke of Europe not as a tourist recounting sights, but as a man who had absorbed the essence of different cultures. He described the paintings of the Louvre, the architecture of St. Petersburg, the music of Vienna, not with the dry precision of a guidebook but with the passion of someone who had been transformed by beauty. In turn, Margaret shared the changes in her own thinking during his absence. She had read widely, not just the approved novels and poetry considered suitable for young ladies, but philosophy, history, and scientific journals. After James's death, Judge Fairchild had stopped monitoring her reading material, and Margaret had taken full advantage of his extensive library. "You would have made an excellent scholar," Samuel observed one evening as they discussed a recent article on geological formations. "In another life, perhaps," Margaret replied. "In this one I've had to content myself with private study." "It doesn't have to remain private," Samuel said. "In London there are salons where women's intellectual contributions are valued. My aunt hosts such gatherings weekly." The London proposal remained unresolved between them. Samuel had not pressed for an answer, but as November progressed, Margaret knew a decision would soon be necessary if travel arrangements were to be made. One crisp morning, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. Margaret's Aunt Sophia, her mother's sister, was planning a Christmas visit. "Excellent timing," Judge Fairchild declared at breakfast. "Sophia can serve as your chaperone to London." Margaret looked up from her plate in surprise. "Father?" "Samuel spoke to me last week about his invitation," her father explained. "I've been considering it. Sophia's involvement removes my primary objection." "You've been discussing me without my knowledge?" Margaret asked, uncertain whether to feel irritated or touched by their concern. "We've been discussing possibilities," her father corrected gently. "The decision remains yours, of course." That afternoon, Margaret walked alone to the creek, needing solitude to clarify her thoughts. The trees stood bare against the November sky, the landscape stripped to essentials. She felt a similar paring down within herself, old fears and expectations falling away, leaving only the essential question: what did she truly want? She had lived so long with prescribed paths: daughter, potential bride, grieving fiancé, that the freedom to choose her future felt both exhilarating and terrifying. At the great oak tree, she traced their initials once more, remembering the children they had been, the futures they had imagined. Neither of them had become exactly who they'd expected to be, yet there was a continuity, a thread connecting past to present that felt right. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Samuel appeared on horseback, slowing as he caught sight of her. "I wasn't expecting to find you here," he said, dismounting. "I was on my way to speak with your father." Something in his manner, a tension, a suppressed excitement, alerted Margaret that this was no ordinary visit. "About London?" she asked. Among other things, he secured his horse to a nearby branch and approached her. "I've received word from my London office. The contracts require my presence sooner than anticipated. If we're to go, we must depart in 2 weeks, not 3. 2 weeks, Margaret repeated. It wasn't much time to prepare for such a journey, both physically and emotionally. "Yes," Samuel confirmed, "and before you make your decision, there's something you should know." He took a deep breath. "I'm not returning to Virginia afterward, at least, not immediately. The company is expanding to include trade with the West Indies and South America. I'll be overseeing the establishment of new routes, new partnerships." "For how long?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the sudden hollow feeling in her chest. "A year, perhaps 2. The implications were clear. If she declined to accompany him now, it might be years before they saw each other again. Whatever had been rekindled between them would have to survive another, longer separation. "I see," she said simply. Samuel took her hands in his expression earnest. "Come with me, Margaret. Not as an obligation or because of what once was between us, but because life offers more than Virginia can contain. Come because you wish to see the world, to expand your mind, to discover who you might become beyond these boundaries." "And us?" she asked quietly. "What of what lies between us now?" "That," he said with a slight smile, "is something we would discover together. No expectations, no demands, just possibility." Margaret looked up at the sky, where geese again flew southward, responding to ancient impulses toward change and renewal. She thought of James, of the safe life she had envisioned with him, a life of predictable contentment but perhaps little growth. She thought of her reading, her secret desires to see the places she had only encountered in books. She thought of her father, aging in this house without her presence. And she thought of Samuel, not as the boy who had left, nor even as the man who had returned, but as a companion for the journey ahead, whatever it might hold. "Yes," she said, the word emerging with surprising ease. "Yes, I'll come with you." Samuel's face transformed with joy, and he lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss against her fingers. "You won't regret it." "I might," Margaret said honestly. "It's a risk, but it's one I choose to take." They stood there beneath the ancient oak, their initials carved in its trunk, their futures unwritten but suddenly rich with possibility. The creek flowed onward as it always had, but Margaret felt herself changing course, like water finding a new channel, not diverted by external forces, but choosing its own path toward the wider world. As they walked back toward the Fairchild house to share their news, Margaret felt a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in years. Grief and duty had been her companions for so long that their absence left space for something new, something that felt remarkably like hope. Samuel's hand found hers as they crested the hill overlooking both their families' estates. Before them lay the familiar, the lands they had known since childhood, the safe and known world. Behind them flowed the creek, winding eventually to the James River, then to the Chesapeake, and finally to the Atlantic, the route they would soon travel together. "Are you afraid?" Samuel asked quietly. Margaret considered the question seriously before answering. "Not of the journey itself," she replied. "Only of discovering I've been wrong about what I want." "That's the beauty of it," Samuel said. "We can always choose again. Life isn't a single choice but a series of them, each building upon the last." As the December sun began its early descent, they continued toward home, their shadows stretching before them, separate but aligned, distinct but moving in the same direction. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time in years, Margaret looked forward to turning the page. The end.